Welcome, I'm Papa John, and this is Superheroes and Sitcoms, sort of. Today, we're talking about, I guess, superhero adjacent, you could call it. I mean, it's a big blockbuster franchise, so why not? It's one of my all-time favorite franchises. I grew up with the early movies. I've been a fan since the early movies. When I caught the first three on cable, I've seen 4 and up in theaters, 5 and up opening weekend. And I just kind of grew up with this franchise. I love it to death. And we now have the 9th installment in this Fast and Furious franchise. Or 10th, I guess, because of Hobbs and Shaw. Anyway, is it one of the best? Is it one of the worst? Let's talk about F9. So F9, Justin Lin is returning to the director's chair. He directed Tokyo Drift. He directed 4, 5, and 6. He's directed 2 of the biggest movies, most well-received movies in the franchise, as well as one, probably the sort of black sheep, if you will, in Tokyo Drift. And then it's one of the more divisive ones in the 4th movie. Some people love it, some people not so much. Anyway, he's directed the most. He's sort of developed the formula for this franchise that's been very successful. And so I was glad to see him return to the director's chair. One thing I loved about this movie is how it calls back to Dom's monologue from the first movie about how his father died in a stock car race and how he nearly beat the other driver responsible half to death. And I love how this movie goes back to that. And shows you the visualization of it and uses it as the sort of catalyst that divided him and his brother Jacob. And for the most part, I think they did a decent enough job explaining why Jacob and Dom were stranded. That being said, at the end of the movie, it goes back to the 1989 segment, and it shows you this supposed to be emotional scene between the two brothers when they were younger after that incident that killed their father. But the emotional thing that they do in that scene kind of takes away from the reason they were estranged in the first place. Because of how that scene plays out at the very end, I think it's the last scene in terms of the flashback storyline, it makes it to where it makes no sense why they were estranged for as long as they were. That being said, it didn't take away too much for me. They didn't do the best job possible, but I do like that they harkened back to the father death. Now, there is something in the monologue that the driver responsible for the Toretto's father's death, there's a monologue that driver gives right before, Dom beats him. And in that monologue, he brings up this sort of metaphor for not just this movie, but the entire franchise that's actually fairly smart, that no one else seems to pick up on or point out. And I don't think this movie will ever get credit for it, because people like to think of this franchise as this dumb, stupid franchise. But it uses this metaphor of the oval racetrack metaphor, and how you always find yourself in the same situations over and over and over again. And it's kind of this metaphor for how this team, Dom's team, finds themselves in these crazy situations over and over and over again that you see in the movies. And so I just think that's just a nice little metaphor type of thing with the oval track, and how you go back and forth and find yourself in the same situations. And then also Roman's storyline. At first, I thought I was going to hate it because of how that early jungle action scene plays out regarding his character. It was really annoying me, and I thought I was going to hate it. But I loved the direction they went, because it just had this fun meta route to it. How Roman was kind of saying the things that critics of this franchise always say. They're practically invincible. They're practically superheroes, and they do all of this stuff and nothing ever happens to them. They have no scars, and he's just basically saying what critics of the franchise have always been saying. And I just love how they add sort of that meta, that super ultra meta factor to this movie. And I love that they do it through Roman. And I did really love that. However, I do think they took it a little too far in the third act. I wasn't a big fan of the Roman side of the third act, the Roman and Tej side of the third act. I thought it was a little too far. And then in terms of Han, they didn't give nearly a good enough explanation for his return. They didn't even really give an explanation. They did some weird Christopher Nolan Tenet type of shit. They didn't give any real explanation to how he survived the explosion. They just do this weird, I don't know what they did. It was so bizarre thing. I don't, honestly, I can't describe it. That's the problem. That's the problem with it. It's just Mr. Nobody's Mr. Nobody, so he just survived because, Mr. Nobody exists and helped him out. It was just ridiculous to me. I hated that aspect, but it didn't really impact the movie because it was a very, very small, minor element. And then being this is a Fast and Furious movie, a big blockbuster action movie, we got to talk about the action. And the vehicular action in this movie is great. All of these movies, except for maybe the fourth one, is a little dated. But all of these movies have great vehicular action. And this movie is no different. You get some awesome stunts and vehicular stunts in there. I mean, they do some crazy stuff with like this magnetic device that I thought was really well done and well executed. I mean, they have some behind the scenes stuff on YouTube that shows these stunts and stuff. And I thought it was all executed really well. However, when it comes to the hand-to-hand combat and the fight scenes, the choreography is great, and you can see the choreography and how it's good. But the way it's edited, you kind of lose track of where they actually are inside the rooms or house. Like there's an instance where I think they find Han or something, and you kind of lose track of who's in the kitchen, who's in this room, and who's in this room, and they're just you just know they're in like the apartment, but you don't know what room each fight is in, because there's like 3 people or 6 people, 3 like fights going on. You don't know who's in what room. So there are some editing things in there. I think it could have used like one more run through the editing room in terms of the hand-to-hand fight scenes, especially when you compare it to like the fight scenes in Furious 7, the Tony Jaa versus Paul Walker fight scene, or even like the melee fight scene with the wrenches between Jason Statham and Vin Diesel. Overall, I think F9 is kind of the one that I'm split on the most, because I think it's one of the more emotional movies, and I think it separates itself from Fate of the Furious mainly because Fate of the Furious to me never really gave me a good enough reason as to why they returned after 7, other than the fact that they just wanted to make more movies. They didn't give me a compelling enough story as to why they continued on. And it just felt like they already had a story in mind, but because of Paul Walker's passing, they just substituted a couple characters. Whereas F9, it feels like they actually had something there. A reason to come back, something to explore, which you didn't quite get in Fate, and that's something I really did appreciate with this movie. And I do think, I don't know if I said this yet, but I do think it's one of the more emotional movies in the franchise. However, I don't think it's necessarily one of the best. I don't think it's the worst, but I do think it's one of the weaker entries. However, I don't think there's a bad entry in here. So I still would give this movie a thumbs up, even if I do think it's one of the weaker in the franchise. Everyone likes to say the early entries are about street racing, and now they're about spies, and to me that's never been the case. The first movie is, just because they are street racers, it doesn't mean it's about street racing. It's a vehicular action movie about family, and that's what all of the early movies are about. That's what all of the newer movies are. They're all vehicular action movies about family. And it's always been that way. That's why I'm a huge fan of the franchise. And this one's no different. It's not the best, but I still really enjoyed this movie. And I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5. If you've seen F9, go ahead and share your thoughts in the comment section down below. I'd love to hear them. A lot of people seem to be hating on this movie, but I really enjoyed it. Even though I only gave it like a 3, I still really enjoyed it. If you enjoyed this review, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. Smash that subscribe button. hit that notification bell as well, and have a great day, and always remember, that's life.